Imagine the world in 1935. The Great Depression is still a heavy shadow. The clouds of the Second World War are gathering, but they haven't broken yet. In Berlin, the air is thick with a different kind of electricity. It isn't just about tanks, planes, or factories. It's about something much stranger, something hidden. While the rest of the world looked toward the future with dread, a small group of men in the heart of the Third Reich was looking backward. They were looking for magic. They were looking for lost continents, holy relics, and the bloodlines of giants. This wasn't a hobby. It wasn't a fringe group of eccentrics meeting in a basement. This was a state-funded, multi-million-dollar intelligence agency. It was called the Ahnenerbe. The name literally means ancestral heritage. On the surface, it looked like a scientific institution. It employed archaeologists, linguists, and historians. But the mission was far more sinister than simple research. The Ahnenerbe was designed to do one thing: rewrite the history of the human race. The leader of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, was obsessed with the idea that the Aryan race hadn't just evolved like everyone else. He believed they were a fallen master race with supernatural origins. He believed that if he could find the physical proof of their greatness, the ruins they left behind, the artifacts they used, he could justify every horror he planned to commit. The Ahnenerbe became a department of alternative facts. If the history books said the Germans were late to develop civilization, Himmler told his scientists to find new books. If the archaeology didn't fit the narrative, they dug until they found something that did, or they simply made it up. They were hunting for the Golden Age. They believed that somewhere in the past, their ancestors possessed high technology and mystical powers. To find it, they would send expeditions to the furthest corners of the globe, from the frozen peaks of the Himalayas to the deserts of South America. This is the story of the Nazi ghost hunters. This is the story of how a government turned mythology into a weapon of war. In the middle of this search for a lost golden age stood a man who looked more like a poet than a soldier. His name was Otto Rahn. He was young, charismatic, and completely obsessed with a story. That story was the legend of the Holy Grail. But Rahn didn't think the Grail was a golden cup used at the Last Supper. He thought it was something much older. To him, the Grail was a Luciferian stone, a jewel that had fallen from the crown of the morning star. He believed it was a symbol of ancient, forbidden knowledge that had been preserved by a group of medieval heretics called the Cathars. Rahn spent his youth wandering the ruins of southern France. He climbed the steep, jagged cliffs of the Pyrenees to reach a fortress called Montségur. It's a haunting place, a massive stone citadel sitting on a lonely mountain peak. In 1244, the Cathars held out there against a massive army before being burned at the stake. Rahn was convinced that before the fortress fell, 4 heretics escaped down the cliffs carrying the Grail with them. He believed they hid it in the deep labyrinthine caves of the Sabardis region nearby. He wrote a book about it called Crusade Against the Grail. It was a strange, romanticized blend of history and myth. And in 1933 it landed on the desk of Heinrich Himmler. Himmler loved it. He didn't care if the history was shaky. He loved the vibe. He invited Rahn to Berlin. Before long, this wandering dreamer was given a black uniform and the rank of SS officer. Suddenly, Rahn had all the money and resources he could ever want. He was sent back to France, not as a lonely scholar, but as a representative of the Reich. He was the Grail hunter. But the more time he spent inside the SS machine, the more the reality began to crush his romantic dreams. You see, Otto Rahn was a misfit. He was a liberal thinker in a totalitarian regime. More dangerously, he was gay in a system that saw homosexuality as a capital crime. He was also rumoured to have Jewish ancestry on his mother's side. He was walking a tightrope over an abyss. He tried to keep up the act. He worked at the Ahnenerbe headquarters, writing reports and planning more expeditions. But the pressure was suffocating. He saw the cruelty of the regime firsthand. He saw how they were twisting his beloved legends into a justification for hate. In a letter to a friend, Rahn wrote, "A man must eat, but I cannot eat what they serve." By 1939, the SS had enough of him. His personal life was under investigation, and he had failed to actually produce the physical Grail. He was forced to resign. In the SS, resignation often had a darker meaning. In March of that year, Otto Rahn walked up into the snow-covered peaks of the Austrian Alps. He sat down in the freezing cold and waited for the end. He was 34 years old. Some say it was a ritual suicide, a final act of devotion to the morning star. Others say the SS gave him a choice: kill yourself or be sent to a camp. The Grail hunter was dead, but the Ahnenerbe wasn't done. They took his research, stripped away the poetry, and kept looking for the stone that fell from the stars. They wanted the power Rahn promised, even if they had to destroy him to get it. While Otto Rahn was chasing ghosts in France, the Ahnenerbe was also focused on the soil beneath their own feet. They needed a holy site in Germany, a place that could rival the prestige of the Vatican or the mystery of the pyramids. They found it in the Teutoburg forest. It's called the Externstein. If you saw it today, you'd be struck by its raw, jagged beauty. It is a series of massive sandstone pillars over 100 feet tall, erupting out of the earth like the spine of a buried giant. For centuries, it was a place of local folklore. But to the Ahnenerbe, it was the Saxon Stonehenge. Himmler's scientists claimed this was the heart of a lost Germanic civilization. They argued that it wasn't just a rock formation, but a sophisticated solar observatory built by ancient Aryans long before the Romans ever stepped foot in northern Europe. There was just one problem: the evidence didn't fit. The most famous feature of the Externstein is a massive stone carving on the side of one of the pillars. It depicts the descent from the cross, a classic piece of 12th century Christian art. It shows Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea lowering Jesus. Beneath them is a strange, curved shape that looks like a bent tree. The Ahnenerbe ignored the Christian figures. Instead, they obsessed over that curved shape. They claimed it was the Irminsul, the sacred world pillar of the ancient Saxons that Charlemagne supposedly destroyed in the 8th century. They argued the carving was a symbol of Christian victory over the superior pagan faith, and they wanted to flip the script. They began massive excavations. They moved thousands of tons of earth, desperate to find proof of a pre-Christian temple. They found almost nothing. They found medieval pottery, some 12th century tools, but zero evidence of an ancient Saxon metropolis. Did that stop them? Not at all. When the archaeology failed, they turned to theatre. They declared the site a national monument. They began holding massive torchlit rituals at the base of the rocks. Imagine thousands of men in uniform, the fire reflecting off the sandstone, chanting about the blood and soil of their ancestors. They were trying to manufacture a religion from scratch. They used the Externstein to tell a lie, that the German people were the original creators of culture and that Christianity had been a foreign infection that suppressed their true power. By turning these rocks into a shrine, they were giving their followers something to worship other than a traditional god. They were worshipping the idea of themselves. The Externstein became a laboratory for rebranding history. If the facts said one thing, the Ahnenerbe simply shouted louder. They created a version of the past where the rocks spoke only to them. In 1936, the Ahnenerbe turned their attention to the frozen forests of the north. They were headed to Karelia, a wild, disputed borderland between Finland and the Soviet Union. They weren't looking for ruins or gold this time. They were looking for sound. The Nazis believed that the Finnish people possessed a racial memory of the ancient North. Specifically, they were obsessed with the Kalevala, an epic poem filled with wizards and warriors. To Himmler, these weren't just stories. He believed the chants of the Finnish shamans were remnants of a lost Aryan science, a way to manipulate the world through vibration and song. To capture this magic, the Ahnenerbe brought something that at the time seemed like science fiction, the magnetophone. This was one of the world's first high-fidelity tape recorders. While the rest of the world was still scratching sounds onto wax cylinders or heavy discs, the Nazis had developed a way to record onto magnetic tape. It was crisp, it was clear, it was terrifyingly advanced. The expedition was led by Yrjö von Grönhagen, a young Finnish researcher who had caught Himmler's eye. He traveled deep into the wilderness to find the eternal singers, old men and women who still practiced the ancient ways. They found a woman named Miron Aku. She was a renowned seer, a woman who spoke to the spirits of the forest. The Nazis set up their heavy, humming machinery in her small wooden hut. They strung wires through the rafters and held microphones to her face. Miron Aku began to chant. She sang of the Väinämöinen, the hero who created the world through song. But as she watched the black tape spinning on the reels, she became deeply unsettled. She didn't understand the physics of magnetism. She saw a machine that was eating her voice. She told the researchers that the machine was trapping her soul. She believed that once the tape finished spinning, her essence would be locked inside that black box, owned by men who spoke a language she didn't understand. The tragedy of the Karelia expedition is the contrast between the technology and the intent. The Nazis used the most advanced engineering on the planet to record a woman they considered a primitive relic of the past. They didn't care about Miron Aku's soul or her culture. They wanted to deconstruct her songs to find a sonic weapon or a hidden frequency of power. When the expedition left, they took the tapes back to Berlin. They archived the voices of the shamans alongside blueprints for rockets and tanks. To the Ahnenerbe, the past was just another resource to be mined, processed, and weaponized. Miron Aku was left behind in the cold, convinced she had been hollowed out by a machine. And in a way, she was right. The Nazi machine took everything it touched and turned it into a ghost. In 1938, as Europe sat on the edge of a knife, the Ahnenerbe launched its most ambitious and famous operation. They were heading to the roof of the world, Tibet. To reach the forbidden city of Lhasa, 5 SS scientists had to trek through the treacherous mountain passes of the Himalayas. They weren't just battling the altitude and the cold, they were navigating a complex geopolitical web. Tibet was largely closed to Westerners, especially Germans, but the leader of the expedition, Ernst Schaefer, was a world-class zoologist and a hunter. He knew how to survive and he knew how to charm his way past border guards. But why Tibet? Why send a team of elite officers to a place with no industry and no modern army? The answer lies in a bizarre racial theory. Himmler was convinced that the survivors of the lost continent of Atlantis, what he called the original Aryans, had fled to the highest peaks of the world to escape a global cataclysm. He believed the Tibetan nobility were the direct descendants of these god-men. The expedition's anthropologist Bruno Beger brought a toolkit that looked like something out of a horror movie. He carried calipers, scales, and plaster. In Lhasa, he would pull Tibetan monks and locals aside and begin a clinical, cold process. He measured the width of their cheekbones. He checked the distance between their eyes. He took plaster molds of their faces to create death masks of the living. Bega was trying to find Nordic features hidden in the faces of the East. He was looking for high bridges on noses or specific skull shapes that would prove that the masters of Tibet were actually long-lost German cousins. It was pseudo-science at its most delusional, but to the Ahnenerbe, it was the missing link they needed to justify their claim to global dominance. But there was a darker, more practical side to this journey. While Bega was measuring skulls, Himmler was thinking about the British Empire. Tibet was the back door to India, the crown jewel of British territory. Himmler hoped to forge an alliance with the Tibetan authorities. He wanted to use the mountains as a base to drop agitators into India to start a revolution against the British. He even sent a personal letter to the Reeting regent, the man ruling Tibet until the Dalai Lama came of age, trying to link the two cultures through their shared use of the swastika, a symbol that in Tibet had meant peace and eternity for thousands of years. By the time the team returned to Munich in 1939, they were treated like rock stars. They brought back thousands of photographs, miles of film, and a collection of local wildlife. They claimed victory. They told the German public that they had found the cradle of their race. But the reality was far more hollow. They had spent months in one of the most spiritual places on Earth and saw only bone measurements and tactical maps. They went looking for gods and found only people they would eventually categorize, rank, and, in their grand plan, discard. If the expeditions to Tibet and Finland seem strange, they are nothing compared to the theories of a man named Hans Herbiger. He wasn't a historian or a biologist. He was an Austrian engineer who claimed the secret of the universe came to him in a vision. Herbiger called it the world ice theory. He believed that the entire universe was made of ice. He argued that massive moons made of frozen water had crashed into the Earth over millions of years. According to him, each time a moon fell, it caused a global apocalypse, wiping out civilizations and changing the very laws of physics. To any real scientist, this was total nonsense. But to the Ahnenerbe, it was a revelation. Why? Because it suggested that in the distant past the Earth's gravity was much weaker because the moon was further away. This gave them an explanation for how ancient monuments were built. Enter Edmund Kiss. He was an archaeologist and a high-ranking SS officer who became obsessed with the ruins of Tiwanaku, high in the Andes Mountains of Bolivia. Tiwanaku is famous for its massive 400-ton stone blocks and the incredible Gate of the Sun. To modern archaeologists, it is a masterpiece of South American engineering, but to Edmund Kiss, it was proof of Nordic giants. Kiss argued that these massive stones were too heavy for ordinary humans to move. He claimed that 15,000 years ago, a Nordic master race had built Tiwanaku. He believed they were able to lift the stones because, according to world ice theory, the moon was in a different position back then. He literally argued that the stones were lighter because the gravity was different. He went even further. He claimed that the carvings on the Gate of the Sun weren't indigenous art, but a sophisticated ice calendar that predicted the next cosmic disaster. The Ahnenerbe poured money into this. They planned a massive expedition to Bolivia to claim Tiwanaku for the Aryan race. They wanted to prove that the ancestors of the Germans had traveled the globe as giants, building civilizations that the rest of humanity was too weak to maintain. It sounds like the plot of a bad pulp novel. But for the men in the black uniforms, this was official state science. They were willing to ignore the laws of gravity and the reality of South American history just to feel like they were part of a supernatural lineage. They weren't just colonizing countries, they were trying to colonize time itself. They wanted to look at every great achievement in human history and put a German flag on it, even if it meant believing that the stars were made of ice. When the war finally ended in 1945, the grand illusions of the Ahnenerbe collapsed into the dirt. The Grail was never found. The ice theory remained a fantasy. The world pillars of the Externstein were revealed to be exactly what they were: medieval carvings made by monks, not ancient monuments built by giants. The elite officers who had traveled to Tibet and Bolivia didn't find the secrets of the universe. They found themselves standing in the ruins of a Reich that had promised them 1,000 years of glory, but delivered only 10 years of horror. Many of the Ahnenerbe's members burned their files, buried their death mask, and tried to disappear back into academia or the shadows of the post-war world. But the story of the Ahnenerbe isn't just a bizarre footnote in a history book. It is a warning. It shows us what happens when a government decides that truth is whatever makes them feel powerful. These men weren't just eccentric treasure hunters. They were the architects of a worldview that dehumanized everyone who didn't fit their manufactured mythology. By claiming that their ancestors were gods, they gave themselves permission to treat their neighbors like animals. They proved that you don't need facts to start a movement. You only need a compelling story and enough people willing to believe it. They weaponized nostalgia. They turned folklore into a roadmap for genocide. Today, the ruins they studied still stand. The winds still howl through the caves of Mont Segur and over the peaks of the Himalayas. But the magic the Nazis sought was never there. The only thing they truly discovered was the depth of their own capacity for delusion. The history of the world is complex, messy, and shared by all of humanity. When we try to narrow it down to fit a single master narrative, we don't just lose the facts, we lose our soul.